May 14, 1916. If Lieutenant George Smith Patton hadn't kept his nerve in the next 60 seconds, he would have died in the dust of a Mexican ranch, shot down before he ever commanded a tank, before he ever led an army, before he ever became the legend the world would call Old Blood and Guts. 3 Mexican revolutionaries were reaching for their weapons. The young lieutenant had a split second to decide. This wasn't a planned military operation. This was supposed to be a grocery run, a simple mission to buy corn for the horses. But what happened next would forge the warrior who would one day save the United States Army at Bastogne, who would strike fear into the hearts of Nazi generals, who would become the most aggressive combat commander in American history. This wasn't just George Smith Patton's first gunfight. This was the moment a privileged cavalry officer discovered he had ice water in his veins, the moment he learned he could kill without hesitation, the moment that would define his entire military career. They would call him Old Blood and Guts, a name earned through decades of leading from the front, charging into battle while other generals commanded from safety. But that nickname was born here, in the choking dust of Mexico, when a 29-year-old lieutenant faced death and didn't blink. This is what happened next. The Mexican border was bleeding. Pancho Villa, the revolutionary bandit-turned-warlord, had just raided Columbus, New Mexico, killing 17 United States citizens in cold blood. The date was March 9, 1916. President Woodrow Wilson was furious. The American public demanded vengeance. The United States Army was ordered south, 10,000 troops commanded by General John J. Pershing with one mission: capture or kill Pancho Villa. They called it the Punitive Expedition. History would remember it as the last great cavalry campaign of the United States military, and serving as Pershing's personal aide was a young lieutenant who was desperate, absolutely desperate, to prove himself in combat. His name was George Smith Patton, but this wasn't the George Smith Patton of legend. Not yet. This was a frustrated officer who had never fired a shot in anger, who had never faced an enemy who was shooting back, who was drowning in paperwork while other men got the glory. He was 29 years old, married to one of the wealthiest women in America, educated at West Point, trained in cavalry tactics and swordsmanship. On paper, George Smith Patton was the perfect officer, but he had never been tested, never proven himself, and it was eating him alive. While other officers led patrols into the hostile Mexican desert, Patton shuffled papers. While cavalry units clashed with Villa's bandits, Patton wrote reports. He was the general's aide, which meant he was a glorified secretary. Every night he lay awake, terrified that the war would end before he ever saw combat. Terrified that he would spend his entire career as a staff officer, never knowing if he had the courage to face death. That fear consumed him. It drove him. It made him volunteer for every dangerous assignment, every risky mission, anything to get away from that desk and into the fight. Then came May 14, 1916. General Pershing needed intelligence on Julio Cardenas, one of Pancho Villa's most trusted captains. Cardenas was a killer, a revolutionary who had ridden with Villa for years, who knew where the bandit leader was hiding. Rumors said Cardenas was staying at Rancho San Miguelito, about 25 miles from Pershing's headquarters. The general mentioned this casually over breakfast, wondering aloud if anyone knew where Cardenas might be. George Smith Patton saw his chance. He practically leaped from his chair. "General, I know the area. Let me take a patrol. I'll find him." Pershing looked at his eager aide and shook his head. "George, I need you here. Send someone else." But Patton wouldn't let it go. He had been practicing his speech, rehearsing the words that might convince Pershing to give him this one chance. "Sir, with respect, I speak Spanish. I know the terrain. I can get close without raising suspicion. If we send a full cavalry patrol, they'll see us coming from miles away. Let me take a few men and some vehicles. I'll bring you Cardenas." The room went silent. Other officers exchanged glances. Taking automobiles into bandit country? That was madness. The roads were terrible. The heat would kill the engines, and if they broke down, they would be isolated, vulnerable, easy targets for Villa's men. Cavalry was reliable. Horses could go anywhere. But cars were newfangled contraptions, barely proven in military service. George Smith Patton was asking to risk his life on unproven technology, chasing a rumor about a bandit's location, with no backup and no support. Major Ryan Hare spoke up. "General, that's too dangerous. If Lieutenant Patton gets stranded out there, we'll have to mount a rescue operation. We can't spare the men." But Patton was relentless. "I'll take full responsibility, sir. If I fail, it's on me. But if I succeed, you'll have Cardenas. You'll have the intelligence we need to find Villa." General Pershing studied his aide. He saw the hunger in Patton's eyes, the desperate need to prove himself. And John Pershing understood that hunger because he had felt it himself as a young officer. He made his decision. "All right, George, take 3 cars, take 10 men. But this is a reconnaissance mission, understand? You're gathering information, not starting a battle. Find out if Cardenas is there, then report back. Don't do anything stupid." George Smith Patton saluted, trying to hide his grin. "Yes, sir. Information only." But everyone in that room knew the truth. If Lieutenant Patton found Julio Cardenas, there was going to be a fight. Old Blood and Guts, though no one called him that yet, wasn't going to Mexico to observe. He was going to kill. May 14th, 1916, dawned hot and clear. Patton assembled his force. 3 Dodge touring cars, 10 enlisted men, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. He also brought his personal touches. 2 ivory-handled Colt .45 revolvers strapped to his belt. Other officers mocked those fancy pistols, called them pretentious, said they made Patton look like a movie cowboy. But George Smith Patton didn't care. He had purchased those weapons with his own money, practiced with them for hours, and he was convinced they would bring him luck. As the 3 automobiles rumbled out of camp, heading south into the desert, none of the men knew they were about to make history. This wasn't the D-Day invasion. This wasn't the breakthrough at Avranches or the race across France. This was a grocery run that would accidentally become the first motorized combat action in United States Army history. And it would reveal something about George Smith Patton that would define his entire career. When the shooting started, he didn't hesitate. The Mexican desert was a furnace. Heat shimmered off the rocky soil, turning distant mountains into wavering mirages. The 3 Dodge automobiles bounced and rattled along primitive trails, kicking up clouds of dust that could be seen for miles. George Smith Patton sat in the lead vehicle, studying the terrain through field glasses, looking for any sign of ambush. This was Pancho Villa's country. The revolutionary bandit had eyes everywhere, sympathizers in every village, scouts watching the roads, informants ready to report troop movements. If Villa's men saw the automobiles coming, they would vanish into the hills like smoke. Patton understood this. He also understood that surprise was his only advantage. So instead of heading directly to Rancho San Miguelito, he devised a cover story. They would stop at the ranch pretending to buy corn for the cavalry horses. It was a legitimate excuse. The United States Army bought supplies from local ranchers all the time. No one would question it. And while his men negotiated for corn, Patton would observe, assess, and decide if Julio Cardenas was actually present. The plan was solid. The execution was perfect. Right up until the moment it all went sideways. The 3 automobiles arrived at Rancho San Miguelito around 11 in the morning. The ranch was larger than Patton had expected. A sprawling compound with a main house, several outbuildings, corrals for livestock, and high adobe walls that could hide dozens of men. George Smith Patton ordered his small convoy to split up, circling the ranch from different angles, blocking the obvious escape routes. Then he approached the main gate with 2 soldiers, playing his role as a buyer seeking corn. A middle-aged man emerged from the house. His name was Jesus Gomez, and he claimed to be the ranch foreman. Patton addressed him in fluent Spanish, explaining that he needed to purchase corn, that he was willing to pay fair prices, that this was routine business. Gomez was nervous. His eyes kept darting toward the outbuildings, toward the corrals, anywhere except at the tall American lieutenant with the ivory-handled pistols. George Smith Patton's instincts screamed danger. Something was wrong. Someone was here. Someone important. He kept talking, kept negotiating, kept Gomez distracted while his eyes scanned the compound. There, movement in the shadows near the main house. A figure watching from behind a doorway. Then another figure, this one moving quickly toward the corrals where horses were saddled and ready. These weren't ranch hands, these were fighters, veterans, men who moved with the controlled urgency of soldiers preparing for action. George Smith Patton made his decision in half a heartbeat. He abandoned the negotiation, stepped back, and drew both revolvers. "Nobody move!" His shout in Spanish echoed across the compound. And that's when the ranch exploded into chaos. 3 men burst from cover near the main house, sprinting for their horses. They weren't carrying corn. They were carrying Mauser rifles and gun belts heavy with ammunition. The lead runner was a tall man with a mustache wearing the crossed bandoliers of a revolutionary officer. Julio Cardenas, the target, the man General Pershing wanted. and he was 30 yards away running for his life. George Smith Patton didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't freeze. He raised both Colt .45s and opened fire. The ivory-handled revolvers roared, bucking in his hands, spitting flame and lead. His first shot missed. His second caught one of Cardenas's companions in the shoulder, spinning the man around. His third and fourth shots stitched the adobe wall as Cardenas dove for cover behind a water trough. Behind Patton, his soldiers were shouting, scrambling for their own weapons, taking positions behind the automobiles. The world narrowed to a tunnel, Patton, his pistols, and the men trying to kill him. One of Cardenas's fighters appeared at a window of the main house, aiming a rifle. Private Michael Malone, one of Patton's men, fired first. His Springfield rifle cracked once, and the Mexican fighter toppled backward, dead before he hit the floor. Now bullets were flying in both directions. Julio Cardenas, pinned behind the water trough, was shooting back with a revolver. His shots kicked up dust near Patton's feet, forcing the lieutenant to dive behind his automobile. This wasn't like the training exercises at West Point. This wasn't like the cavalry drills or the target practice. This was real. Men were trying to kill Lieutenant George Smith Patton, and if he made one mistake, he would die here in the Mexican dust, 29 years old, forgotten by history. But here's what George Smith Patton discovered about himself in that moment. He wasn't afraid. He should have been terrified. He should have been shaking, should have been paralyzed by the realization that he was in a genuine firefight with experienced killers. Instead, he felt calm, focused, almost euphoric. This was what he had been born for. This was his purpose. He reloaded his revolvers with practiced speed, his fingers steady, his mind clear. Around him, the battle continued. His soldiers were firing methodically, controlling their shots, aiming carefully. Private George Robinson spotted movement near the corrals and dropped another of Cardenas's men with a single shot to the chest. That left Julio Cardenas and one remaining fighter, both pinned down, both running out of options. The remaining fighter made his break first. He burst from cover near the house, sprinting for a gap in the compound walls. He almost made it. He was 10 feet from freedom when 3 rifles fired simultaneously. The impact threw him forward and he collapsed in a heap, his Mauser clattering across the ground. Now it was just Cardenas. Julio Cardenas, captain in Pancho Villa's army, veteran of 100 fights, cornered by a young United States lieutenant who refused to back down. For a long moment, nobody moved. The gunfire stopped. Silence settled over the ranch, broken only by the whimpering of wounded men and the nervous stamping of horses in the corrals. George Smith Patton called out in Spanish, "Cardenas, you're surrounded. Surrender and you'll be treated fairly." The response was a gunshot that punched through the hood of Patton's automobile, barely missing his head. So much for negotiation. Patton signaled his men to spread out, to cover every angle. Then he did something that would become his trademark in the decades ahead. He led from the front. While his soldiers provided covering fire, Lieutenant George Smith Patton advanced directly toward Cardenas's position, both pistols raised, walking steadily through the gunfire like he was strolling through a garden. It was insane. It was reckless. It was exactly the kind of aggressive action that would one day make him the most feared American general of World War II. Julio Cardenas saw him coming. The Mexican revolutionary rose from behind the water trough, rifle coming up, trying to get one last shot at this crazy American who walked into bullets like they were raindrops. 3 men fired at once, Private Malone's rifle, Private Robinson's rifle, and both of George Smith Patton's ivory-handled Colt .45s. Julio Cardenas jerked backward as multiple rounds struck his chest. He staggered, tried to stay on his feet, then collapsed against the wall. He was dead before he hit the ground. The entire firefight had lasted less than 5 minutes. 3 of Pancho Villa's fighters were dead, including his trusted captain. Not a single United States soldier was wounded. And standing in the center of the compound, ivory-handled revolver smoking in his hands, was a young lieutenant who had just discovered he was born for war. George Smith Patton stood over Julio Cardenas's body, breathing hard, adrenaline surging through his veins. This was it. This was the moment he had dreamed about since childhood. He had faced the enemy. He had fought. He had won, and he had killed. The theoretical warrior had become real, but there was no time to celebrate. The gunfire would have been heard for miles. If there were more of Villa's men in the area, they would be converging on the ranch right now. Patton's small force, 3 automobiles and 10 soldiers, would be overwhelmed in minutes. "Strip them," Patton shouted. "Take their weapons and ammunition. We're leaving in 2 minutes." His men scrambled to obey, moving quickly through the compound. They collected Mauser rifles, bandoliers, revolvers, anything of military value. They also found documents, letters, maps, notes that might contain intelligence about Villa's movements. George Smith Patton grabbed everything, stuffing papers into his pockets. But then he did something that historians would argue about for decades. He ordered his men to strap the dead bodies to the hoods of the automobiles. It wasn't an order born from cruelty, though it looked barbaric. Patton needed proof. He needed evidence that he had actually killed Julio Cardenas, that this hadn't been just another meaningless skirmish with random bandits. Without proof, this would be just another patrol report, another footnote. But if he returned with the bodies, with Cardenas himself displayed for General Pershing to see, then this would be a victory, a confirmed kill, a military success that would make the newspapers, that would prove Lieutenant George Smith Patton was a combat officer, not a staff aide. So they lashed Julio Cardenas's corpse to the hood of the lead automobile like a trophy buck. They tied the other 2 bodies to the remaining vehicles, then they mounted up and raced north, back toward the United States lines, praying they would reach safety before Villa's reinforcements arrived. The return journey was a nightmare of heat, dust, and paranoia. Every hill could hide an ambush. Every distant rider could be the vanguard of a revenge attack. But George Smith Patton pushed the automobiles hard, driving recklessly over the rough trails, determined to get his men and his proof back to headquarters. They roared into General Pershing's camp just after 4 in the afternoon. 3 dusty Dodge touring cars with dead Mexican revolutionaries strapped to their hoods like bizarre ornaments. Soldiers came running from every direction, staring in shock and fascination. Officers emerged from their tents, unable to believe what they were seeing. And walking toward them, ivory-handled pistols still holstered at his belt, was Lieutenant George Smith Patton, grinning like a man who had just won the lottery. General John J. Pershing stood waiting, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "George, I told you to gather information. What the hell is this?" Patton snapped a salute. "Sir, I have a report. Julio Cardenas is dead. We engaged his force at Rancho San Miguelito. 3 hostiles killed, no friendly casualties. We also recovered documents that may contain intelligence on Villa's location. And, sir..." He paused, savoring the moment. This was the first motorized combat action in United States Army history. Automobiles, not cavalry. We used speed and surprise, and it worked perfectly. The camp fell silent. Officers stared at the bodies. Then, slowly, General Pershing began to smile. It was a rare expression for the stern commander, but he couldn't help himself. His young aide had just done something unprecedented. Had proven that automobiles could be used for more than transportation. They could be weapons of war. Had killed one of Pancho Villa's most trusted officers in a stand-up gunfight, and had done it with the kind of aggressive audacity that Pershing himself admired. "Well done, Lieutenant. Well done." Those 3 words changed George Smith Patton's life. Within hours, the story spread through the punitive expedition. Within days, newspapers across the United States were running headlines. "Pershing's aide kills Villa's captain in desperate gunfight." The New York Times published detailed accounts. The Los Angeles papers celebrated their native son. George Smith Patton became famous overnight. But more importantly, he became something else. He became confident. Absolutely, unshakably confident that he was born for combat, that he had the courage and skill to face any enemy, that he would never again doubt his own nerve. And there was something else, something darker, that George Smith Patton discovered about himself that day. He liked it. Not just the victory, not just the success, but the killing itself. The moment when he pulled the trigger, when the bullet struck home, when men fell dead because he had shot them. That moment gave him a rush unlike anything he had ever experienced. It terrified him and thrilled him at the same time. Years later in World War II, when George Smith Patton stood on a battlefield in Sicily, when he watched his tanks destroy German positions, when he walked among enemy dead and felt that familiar cold satisfaction, he would think back to May 14th, 1916, to the ranch in Mexico, to the first time he discovered what kind of man he really was. They would call him Old Blood and Guts because he led from the front, because he was willing to bleed alongside his men, because he demanded their blood and guts in pursuit of victory. But the nickname was born here, in the dust of a Mexican ranch, when a young lieutenant proved he had the guts to fight and the cold nerve to kill without hesitation. The impact of that brief firefight rippled far beyond the punitive expedition. George Smith Patton had proven something revolutionary, that automobiles could be decisive weapons in modern warfare. For centuries, cavalry had dominated mobile operations. Horses were reliable, could traverse any terrain, could carry soldiers into battle with speed and power. But George Smith Patton had just demonstrated that internal combustion engines could do everything horses could do, only faster, more efficiently, and with greater firepower. Within weeks, the United States Army began experimenting with motorized units. Officers who had dismissed automobiles as novelties suddenly saw their potential. And leading those discussions was Lieutenant Patton, who wrote detailed after-action reports analyzing every aspect of the engagement. He calculated speeds, fuel consumption, firepower ratios. He proposed organizational structures for motorized cavalry. He became the Army's leading advocate for mechanized warfare, all because of a 5-minute gunfight at a Mexican ranch. But the personal impact was even greater. Before May 14, 1916, George Smith Patton was just another ambitious officer, indistinguishable from hundreds of West Point graduates hoping for advancement. After that date, he was marked as special. General Pershing noticed him now, really noticed him, saw the potential for greatness. When the United States entered World War I a year later, Pershing didn't hesitate. He brought George Smith Patton to France and gave him command of the 1st United States Tank Battalion. Why? Because he had seen Patton under fire, had seen him stay calm when bullets were flying, had seen him kill without hesitation. That's the officer you want leading armored warfare, someone who doesn't freeze when the shooting starts, and George Smith Patton proved Pershing right. In World War I, he led his tanks into the Meuse-Argonne offensive, was wounded by machine gun fire, refused to be evacuated, and continued directing his units while lying in a shell hole bleeding from a hip wound. That's old blood and guts. That's the warrior who was forged in Mexico. But here's what makes the Rancho San Miguelito fight truly significant. It wasn't a major battle. 3 men died. No strategic objectives were captured. Pancho Villa escaped and was never caught. By any objective military standard, this was a tiny, meaningless skirmish, a footnote in a failed expedition. Yet it changed history because it transformed George Smith Patton from a man who wondered if he could kill into a man who knew he could. That psychological transformation was the seed from which everything else grew. When Patton stood in his command tent in World War II, planning the relief of Bastogne, he drew on the confidence he gained in Mexico. When he drove his Third Army across France at speeds that shocked German commanders, he was applying lessons learned with those 3 Dodge automobiles in the desert. When he stood before his troops and delivered profane, aggressive speeches that inspired men to charge into hell itself, he was channeling the warrior spirit he discovered at Rancho San Miguelito. The German military studied George Smith Patton obsessively during World War II. They called him Der Blutige General, the Bloody General. They knew his reputation for speed, aggression, and relentless attack, and they feared him more than any other Allied commander. Why? Because old blood and guts had spent 3 decades proving that he would never stop, never hesitate, never show mercy. That reputation was born on May 14, 1916. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, arguably Germany's finest tactical commander, once remarked to his staff that fighting Patton was like fighting a ghost that attacks from all directions at once. That ghost learned to kill in Mexico. The United States military still studies the Rancho San Miguelito action in staff colleges. Not because of its tactical complexity, it was a simple ambush and firefight, but because of what it represents. It represents the birth of motorized warfare in the United States Army. It represents the moment when one officer's initiative and courage created new doctrine, and it represents the making of a legend. So what do we take from this story? What does a grocery run turned gunfight teach us about General George Smith Patton, the man who would become the most aggressive combat commander in United States military history? First, it shows us that old blood and guts wasn't born fearless. He was born ambitious, yes. Born competitive, absolutely. But the courage to face death calmly, to shoot men without hesitation, to walk through gunfire like it didn't exist, that was learned. George Smith Patton discovered his warrior nature on May 14, 1916, and he spent the rest of his life cultivating it, sharpening it, turning it into the weapon that would terrify the German army in World War II. Second, it demonstrates the importance of that first test. Every combat soldier faces it, the first time someone tries to kill you, the first time you pull the trigger with lethal intent. Some men freeze, some men break, some men discover they can never do it again. But George Smith Patton discovered he was born for it, that combat was his natural element, that he was capable of exceptional violence in pursuit of victory. That self-knowledge shaped everything that came after. Third, the Rancho San Miguelito fight reveals Patton's tactical genius. He wasn't ordered to attack the ranch, he was ordered to gather information. But when opportunity presented itself, when he recognized that Julio Cardenas was within reach, Old Blood and Guts made an instantaneous decision to fight. That pattern, seeing opportunity where others saw risk, attacking when others would wait for orders, became his trademark. It's why he relieved Bastogne when everyone said it was impossible. It's why he crossed the Rhine before the British. It's why his Third Army advanced farther and faster than any army in history. The instinct to attack, to seize the initiative, to hit the enemy before the enemy expected it, that instinct was validated on May 14, 1916, when a grocery run turned into a gunfight and George Smith Patton won. Fourth, this story illuminates the role of luck in Patton's legend. He could have died that day. A Mexican bullet could have ended his life at age 29, and the world would never have known the name George Smith Patton. There would have been no Third Army, no relief of Bastogne, no race across France. History would have unfolded differently. But he survived. More than survived, he won decisively. And that victory convinced him that he was destined for greatness, that fate itself was protecting him for future glory. Today, more than a century after that dusty firefight at a Mexican ranch, historians still debate George Smith Patton's legacy. Some criticize his language, his methods, his abrasive personality. But no one, absolutely no one, questions his courage or his tactical brilliance. Old Blood and Guts was the real deal, a warrior in an age of managers, a fighter who led from the front when others commanded from headquarters. And it all started with a grocery run that turned into his first gunfight. The ivory-handled pistols he carried that day are now in museums, displayed as artifacts of military history. The automobiles are long gone, scrapped or forgotten. But the legend lives on. George Smith Patton proved that day in Mexico that he had the heart of a warrior, the nerve of a killer, and the tactical brilliance of a master strategist. And the United States Army would benefit from those qualities for the next 3 decades as Old Blood and Guts led American soldiers to victory after victory. So the next time you hear the name Patton, remember where it started. Not at D-Day, not at Bastogne, not in the deserts of North Africa or the fields of France. It started at Rancho San Miguelito on May 14, 1916, when a young lieutenant named George Smith Patton went to buy corn and instead discovered his destiny. They called him Old Blood and Guts because he understood warfare at its most primal level: kill or be killed, attack or die, victory or death. And he learned those lessons not in textbooks or classrooms, but in a 5-minute firefight in the Mexican desert, when 3 revolutionaries made the fatal mistake of drawing weapons on a man who was born for war. That's the legend. That's the warrior. That's George Smith Patton, Old Blood and Guts himself, and this is where the legend began. If this story of how a simple grocery run transformed into the defining moment of young George Smith Patton's life moved you, hit subscribe. We're bringing you more untold stories from the man they called Old Blood and Guts, the most aggressive, most successful, most feared combat commander the United States has ever produced. Because General George Smith Patton's story didn't end in Mexico, it was only beginning.